Hello and welcome to the Corporate Jet Investor Podcast. This week, we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Craig Picken, the eponymous founder of Craig Picken Executive Search. How are you?
How do you spell eponymous?
I know, it's good, isn't it?
That's a big word.
I haven't used it for a long time. I'm delighted to have. That's the only reason we got you on.
Well, if you call me eponymous, I'm coming on. So,
how would you describe your business?
I am a headhunter. I'm an executive recruiter, but I like to think more than that. It's one of those things where I start. I do a lot of business coaching. I do a lot of executive coaching. I got trained in executive coaching. So I try to be, more than just a recruiter, headhunter. I try to be somebody who understands the business and can help people think about it a little bit. Well, yeah, look, I'm a search guy. I'm an executive recruiter, but people are calling me for a whole lot more than that. And I think that's kind of the part I really enjoy, is getting involved in the business aspect and helping people think through problems and situations or whatever, or just think about their people, their teams, things of the sort. So that's a good long way of saying I'm a headhunter.
But you're completely embedded in business aviation. I know you do commercial aviation and aerospace, but your background is. Take us through your background. You've worked for manufacturers. You've worked for fractionals. Yeah.
So when I got out of the Navy a long time ago, I talked my way into a job at Gulfstream Aircraft and started as a sales engineer. And some of the, Scott Neal and I, Scott at Gulfstream and I used to sit across and stare at each other in a trailer. And Jeff Cole with Bombardier was in the same trailer. And so that's where I started there. I did 4 years at Gulfstream. And, I think I realized that, Gulfstream's a great company. And, in the 4 years I was there, it was just learning so much. And then I went to Bombardier for 3 years. And then after 3 years of Bombardier, I actually left the industry, which was it was a great thing to do. And then I came back in 2007, 2008 with my own business. And that's, so the Gulfstream, the Bombardier business, business aviation, FlexJet, gave me a good start. And here we are 17 years later as a search guy.
And I know a lot of people are going to be asking, what were you doing in the Navy?
I flew E-2 Hawkeyes in the Navy. Life at 120 knots. Now, I wasn't a pilot. I was a backseat guy, but had a great time for 8 years. 325 carrier landings on the USS Ranger. Couple combat cruises, good time. Couple years in Europe. Decided I didn't want to go back to sea anymore. Time to go do different things. So. But I've been around aviation since 1985. I just disclosed my age.
Yeah. And you don't look that old. You're too healthy. Not many people work for two OEMs, do they? And how important or how obvious is the cultural difference between going from Gulfstream to Bombardier or vice versa?
It's a big cultural difference. I don't know. I don't know Gulfstream today. It's just a company I worked at, years ago. I think that there's a lot of, a lot of carryover from, Gulfstream. What the Gulfstream today, people don't realize 30 years ago was 72 hours away from closing its doors. I mean, out of business, sayonara. Ted Forsman comes in, buys the company. And Ted did what really good turnaround people do. He went out and found the best team and scoured the industry for the best team in aviation. Bill Boyster, Brian Moss, Fred Breidenbach, Press Henny, Joe Lombardo. Chris Davis was the CFO. Chris was like a no name and candidly, the better finance person was somebody that Chris brought on board. But Boyster built, I mean, not, but Forsman built this powerhouse team, and they bet the bank on the G5. And man, that place was brutal to work at. I mean, it was, it was a true turnaround, and you showed up at 7:30 in the morning and you left at 6:30, 7 at night, and you got great things happened. You got yelled at. It was like, put on your battle armor. Yeah, we're trying to do great things here. The fact that Gulfstream today is, 9 aircraft delivered on time, on budget, the 700, the 800, the 400 now, the 500, the 600 10 years ago. I think that's a testament today that they continue to just perform. Bombardier was a different culture. Bombardier was a lot of, we try to be multicultural. We try to be collaborative. We try to do things like that. And, and I think that a lot of the success they could have had got lost in the noise at the time. They tried to take on too much. Let's try to do a C series. Let's try to do the Learjet 85. Let's try to focus on a whole bunch of different things. And they ended up losing a lot of money. And I think today it's a totally different company. It builds great products. But that was the difference in culture at the time.
It's amazing to think, isn't it, that Gulfstream, for the last 20 years has just been safe, stable. It's hard to remember. Very few people can remember those days when Forsman came in. And then Bombardier had its scary points with the C series. It's now looking like a much, much stronger company than it was 5 years ago. It's interesting, though, isn't it? You've got Dassault, you've got Bombardier, you've got Gulfstream, all competing, all completely different culturally. When you're recruiting, how do you, from the outside, work out what a company's culture is?
I learned their cultures pretty quickly, and that's the one thing. So I deal with mostly small mid-market companies, and I think small business. I mean, I'm a small business guy. So I think small business. I think down in the trenches, all hands on deck. Everybody's got to, you're doing work. You're taking out the trash. If your ego can't accept a messy office in the back of a hangar, then you probably don't need to be working there. I think learning the culture of the companies is the key to finding successful people. So, I think about like today, what's happening in the industry. Look at, one of the things, we were talking about Ken Rickey and FlexJet before we came on board. Those guys are interesting to me because you've got Ricky, Silvestro, Bob Sullivan, Rossi's up in there, Andrew Collins. Those guys have been together for 20 years. I mean, you think as a management team, they've been together for 20 years. And, they know how they think. Each other thinks, and they're able to feed off each other's strengths, and they're able to kind of, manage each other's weaknesses. But, collaboratively, they're a 20-year team, and you see what they're doing now. I think versus like a NetJets, which is a little bit more, I like to laugh, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I call it the cult of NetJets. It's the NetJets way. It's it's a little bit more of a, with FlexJet, I see a little bit more of a down in the trenches. We're getting dirty together. We're just figuring this thing out. And NetJets is a much more, I don't want to say staid atmosphere. That's not the right one, but it's an atmosphere where it's steady. There's not a lot of highs or lows or anything. It's just a very steady. It's a good business. They got Berkshire behind them. AJ's done a good job up there, but it's just a totally different it's not the rough and tumble culture that FlexJet is and has been, has used to be monumentally successful.
Although NetJets has been an amazing turnaround since '08, and when Buffett said that it could have gone under, and you're right. I feel guilty that we never write about NetJets. They're opening hangars here. They're bringing in tens of aircraft a year, and I've written so much more about Wheels Up in the last 3 years than I ever have about NetJets.
Well, once again, yes, NetJets, those guys, 10 years ago, I literally was having a conversation and somebody said fractional aircraft ownership is dead. And you're like, are these guys going to survive? And you could see where the way the contracts were written. And that's, a little bit of my FlexJet background early in the day. You saw where the way the contracts were written, there was a lot of risk in the business, but all the fractionals have gotten smart. And the interesting thing to me is, I see business aviation growth, and it's going to continue to grow, and more people are coming in. Yeah, there was a lot of tailwinds behind the pandemic, but I see where, you look at Embraer, you look at, Bombardier, you look at Gulfstream, they're putting big orders into the fractionals. Which in turn is giving the OEMs, or the fractionals are putting big orders into the OEMs, which in turn is giving the OEMs a lot of supply chain, personnel, product stability. And because they have that, they're not risking whitetails. It makes their order book a little less lumpy. They can go to their suppliers with more predictability. So ultimately, I'm really liking what NetJets, all the fractionals. Eventually Wheels Up is going to figure itself out. I've been a little bit skeptical on it over the last couple of years. It looks to me a little like, today it looks to me a little like Flight Options did 25 years ago. But George will take that in a new direction. But I'm actually enjoying seeing how the fractionals are really growing business aviation. There's a lot of interest in it. I was at breakfast the other day with a good friend of mine, and he's thinking about he's asking me, what's a Challenger 300, buy in, things like that. So he wants to get into it. I think that the growth of the industry comes on the back of the fractional providers.
You've been around long enough to know how cyclical business aviation is. Do you think that's changed?
I think it's becoming less lumpy. Once again, when I think will it change? Yeah. It goes up, it goes down. There's going to be some sort of economic event. I don't know if hopefully we'll never see something like we did in 2008. I remember talking to George Marburger at Jet Effect back in, I think it was 2009, 2010. I'm like, what's a G5 going for, or G500 sell for? He goes, I don't know. The only quote I can tell you is what somebody's willing to pay for it. But you had a lot of sideline money came in, and they bought some cheap airplanes, and a couple of years later they were flipping them and making millions of bucks. Then you saw the same thing, during COVID, where, when demand went nuts. Now demand has pulled back a little bit since COVID, but I think the way the industry is set up now, I think the OEMs are more disciplined in their production. I think the way the fractionals are set up, have got their contracts done, I think it's going to become a little less lumpy in the world. Now, I don't know what the green initiative in Europe is going to do, if it's going to screw it all up or if everybody's just going to ignore it. But that's for another conversation, I guess.
You deal a lot with, you have a lot of customers in the supply chain. Do you think supply chains are actually improving?
No, not at all. Unfortunately, I wish I could say, yeah. I was talking I did a podcast last week with my good friend, investment banker, Bill Alderman. And the challenge you've got on the supply chain, it's very interesting, is, COVID, a weak industry, and then COVID drove a lot of weak players out. And you've got a lot of single family, or you had a lot of entrepreneurial, machine shops, build to print suppliers who supply the Honeywells, the Collins, et cetera. And a lot of them they just couldn't make it. So all of a sudden now you've got a lot of qualified suppliers that fell out of the industry. Private equity is doing it. They're trying to rebuild them. But I'll just give you, for instance, I placed a couple of CEOs in the engine component manufacturing space, and they're trying to rebuild their backlogs with GE and Pratt, and the people are the issues. There's so much of a long tail from this COVID thing. I think we're probably another 3-4 years before we'll start to really see stability in the supply chain again.
That's the most negative I've heard. People normally just say in a year's time, and then that year never comes.
No, man. I wish it'd be. I wish I could say a year's time, but that's the interesting thing is it's the build to print business was you were a slave at one point to the OEM. If you were just contract manufacturing OEM parts, you were a slave to the OEM, and they expected a cost reduction every year. Now it's the other way around. If the OEMs are kind of saying, if we lose a qualified supplier, it's very hard for us to go find another qualified supplier. So that's going to put pricing pressure on the OEMs. And I keep talking about, going back to your last conference when Ken Rickey, I'm going to pick on Ken today. When he talked about, what's the worst thing, what are the biggest hurdles in business aviation? He talked about, private equity and costs and things like that. FBOs being bought by private equity and everybody kind of wanting to make some money in this business. It will eventually work itself out. Free markets work well, but I think right now what you're seeing is, a lot of demand and supply chain that is still trying to keep up. We're going to get better. It's not that I'm negative. We're going to get better. It's just going to take a little while to do so.
You mentioned Embraer, and I know Steve Friedrichs, his CCO. In the last few years, he's admitted that he's been going in and selling to suppliers on, going in and trying to convince them that they should be giving Embraer time. And I think it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit, since we keep talking about Flex, when Flex a few years ago took their top customer relationship person and made her in charge of pilot relations. If you can see the problem coming, you can start changing it to a certain extent. Does anything else worry you at the moment?
Nothing really worries me. Here's what I think. Here's what worries me. If you go back to, I think, to 2020, Embraer stock was like $5. I think it's seen an 800% growth since then. The most understated team in aviation, Michael Amalfitano, to me, has done an unbelievable job with Embraer. Positive executive. They make great products, but great products don't sell themselves. And those guys have done a wonderful job putting with the 300s, the Praetors, getting the mid-sized stuff into the marketplace. They're getting big fractional orders. Those guys have done a great job. So they're forward thinking, and now they're building some MROs. I think just built an MRO in Dallas. They got to Nashville. They're building out their OEM supply chain, and I think they're in a really good spot. Falcon Jet makes a great airplane, but I'd be challenged. I know who they are, but I'd be challenged to say who are the top 3 executives in the United States driving Falcon Jet's business right now, and so they're a little bit, they're not out there. I mean, now Falcon makes 40 airplanes a year, and they got a great reputation, but and maybe they're happy with 40 airplanes a year. Where do I see the opportunities in the industry? I see the opportunities. We got to be looking at our 25 and 30-year-olds and saying, hey, where's our next generation of leaders coming from? And what do we want them to be? And what do we want them to look like? And that includes pilots, engineers, salespeople. What are we doing to build these businesses for long-term sustainment and growth?
One interesting trend, actually, just an aside, I remember having dinner with an aircraft broker doing a big dinner at one of the shows, and I was on a table with the aircraft broker, Michael, Louisa, my wife, and this very nice couple who owned a car dealership or a series of car dealerships. And watching Michael turn on the sales, it was just, as soon as and he's always like an amazingly personable, lovely guy, but watching Michael sell to these car dealers was absolute art. It was wonderful to watch. One of the interesting trends in the last 10, 15 years is if you look at the people who are running most of the OEMs, they're not from a hard sales background, are they?
No, they're not. Martel, Eric Martel at Bombardier. I think he was a supply chain guy, wasn't he? I mean,
Ron Draper at Textron, same.
Ron Draper at Textron.
Thierry at Dassault Finance.
Yep.
Mark at Gulfstream Customer Service. It's an interesting change, isn't it? From the old days when it was always a salesperson.
Yeah, but I think that the discipline of leadership and it's a very complex industry where, I always tell people like my favorite person to place is an engineer with an MBA because they understand the process, they understand the numbers. I really like people with finance backgrounds, when I'm talking to somebody with a great finance background. I think I get it. They get it. They understand the numbers. They can look at a different picture. And I think from just the overall complexity of the operation, I've always been a salesperson. So I always saw kind of the tip of the spear, I understood the customer part of it. But then when you talk to the finance people and you talk to the engineers and I've got so many stories of being humbled by phenomenal engineers who just, said, hey, you need to look at it differently. And I go, wow, I really do. So I think that's kind of the benefit of these guys is they understand the entirety of the business from the supply chain, from the supplier angle, from, what the customers are looking for from product development. How much is all this going to cost? What kind of margins, can we make on this from a gross? So, salespeople are kind of like me, where we're all like on go, and sometimes we're looking at there's as somebody said to me once, there's reality and then there's salesperson reality. So there's the difference.
Yeah, but there's so much fun to hang around with salespeople.
Salespeople are awesome.
You specialize in senior level recruitment. You don't tend to get involved in. Do you ever do entry level? No.
No, not really. And I should. I do like to keep my eyes on the up and coming executives, and and this is it's a little bit hard for me because a lot of times they're so focused and face down. So you have to ask around, like, who's the up and coming. Who's up and coming? Who's great? Who's the next person to know? And companies are, they're keeping our eye on those people too. So, but not really the entry level, but I'm always like to see who the rising executives are and kind of build relationships with them.
How do you build that? Is it from a LinkedIn or a...
A lot of times I'm just reaching out to them and saying, hey, so-and-so said some nice things about you. And I don't know you from Adam and you don't know me. Here's who I am. This is what I do. Tell me about your career. What's your growth? What's your goals? Where do you want to go? What's your relationship? It's funny. A young fella who grew up 2 doors down from me, I'm actually good friends with his parents, is now the chief commercial officer at a company in Chicago called Setna IO. And he's banging it. He's 32 years old, I think, and he is just knocking it dead. Setna IO is a aftermarket parts support company for commercial aviation. And I just liked him because when he was 15 years old, he was out running at 6 o'clock in the morning and getting ready to go play lacrosse. He became an All-American lacrosse player. And I just watched him grow up. And one day when, he was 23 years old, graduating from college, I called up some clients of mine and said, you need to meet this kid. He's pretty good. There's another fella at a private equity group now. I'd laugh because I was talking to him yesterday. 7 years ago, I had the damnedest time. It was really, really hard getting him to accept this role. And he was an engineering manager at Williams Engines, had his MBA from Michigan, engineering degree from Michigan State. And private equity group said, hey, we're looking for somebody that looks like this to go be for an associate role. And I'm talking to him like, don't turn this job down. He's like, oh, it's Florida. It's not Michigan. Yak, yak, yak. And I'm like, John, don't turn this down. And he took the role. And in 7 years, he's created several theses revolving around space, satellites, satellite communication. One of the companies that he built the thesis around is about ready to go public for $6 billion. I texted him yesterday. I'm like, aren't you happy you took that job? And he's just banging it. I love to see young people like that who have got, just so much potential, and they just need a place to show it. They just need a place to build that potential.
So are you always looking, or do you wait until you get a specific mandate and then start calling around?
I'm always looking. My success comes when a company calls me and I've got 2 or 3 people like, hey, do you know this person? Do you know that person? Here's somebody I'm thinking about for you. That's success to me. If you're out, searching is it's kind of like fishing and catching, right? People want to go catching. They don't want to go fishing. Building relationships. I love building relationships with people and just saying, hey, look, what are your goals for the future? And trying to help them, find those places, and a lot of that comes like your conferences, talking young executives. Hey, look, it's an investment in your career. Spend some money, go to a conference, go meet people, talk, find out what's happening in the industry.
I didn't pay for you to say that, but I appreciate it. Have you ever placed anyone where do you always have a little niggle, a little uncertainty that it's not going to work out? Because it's such a, there's so many things can change, like the management can change, the strategy, or and have you ever placed someone where you thought, this is a 50-50, but they've worked out brilliantly?
Yeah. I've placed people where they've been 50-50 and it worked out brilliantly. And I've worked with some folks that, look, I'd love to say I'm perfect, but I'm not. You do all the due diligence, you do all the references, you find, and then, they come into an organization and they flame out. And sometimes it's the organization. Sometimes you call up the person, you don't know what's going on in the back of their mind. It's the people business. Thankfully the negative experiences are a fraction of the positive ones. But more due diligence is required. How's that? And I'm very careful with that. There's only me. I don't have a big company behind me. It's my reputation. It's my diligence. It's, people are looking at me. And that's a scary place to be in from my standpoint.
Why don't you have a team of researchers and other people placing?
Because I am the ultimate micromanager, honestly. And everybody asked me that. And I originally started out wanting, to build a team. But I found out that, when I'm talking to people, I get a sense of who they are. I get a sense for what they're about. So I feel like, if a researcher is handing me a stack of something and then I have to go through it and say, okay, what, who, what, when, where, why, and then it's more, why do you like this person? I'm asking them versus me just finding it out myself. I don't, I'm not trying to be everything to everybody. It's a very focused business. And I find that when I know the people and I build the relationships, I'm much more effective than if I had a big team behind me and, was worried about them versus the customers that I have.
When you're dealing with a client, and actually let's start with how you started. So when you set up, what was your strategy on how to find customers? And obviously I'd know this.
Do you remember the World Aviation Directory, that big thick book? Okay, I sat there and I said, we started this business, and my wife is great. I'm going to give my wife a lot of props. She's great. And we started this business, and I had the World Aviation Directory, and I looked at it and I said, where do you think we start? And she goes, how about A? Like A. So I started with A, and my first company was a company called Aeroturbine. And I did a lot of work with them. They're not around anymore. They got bought by AirCap. They're part of AirCap now. So Aeroturbine was my first customer, and then I built from there. And I business aviation was not my first set of customers. But then I just kind of built the business around engine leasing, commercial engine leasing, USM, used serviceable materials. The commercial business, and then people from aviation, from the biz outside of the house started calling me up and saying, hey, look, we're, thinking about doing this. I did a lot of work with NetJets. I did some work with FlexJet, EJM, several, and just, over the years, just kind of gradually built. So here I am 17 years later. I just, gradually built the business.
Do you see them as two different markets, the civil and the commercial airline market and the business jet market? Are they very different?
No, not really. In some ways, shapes or form, they are. But I think the key is, if I ask a client, do you know who the best person in your industry is? So I'm who's the best aircraft broker, or who are the 10 best aircraft brokers out there? Do they know? And the first question I said, who would you like to have for this role? Tell me a person you'd like to have for this role. And they get it. So the way I look at it is, in the industry that you're in, every business should know, who their competitors are, and who they emulate, who do they hate, who can they not absolutely stand because they're so good. Well, why don't you have that person, instead of competing against that person, why don't you have them on your team? So I just, kind of give people a little bit, give them some ways to think about things differently a little bit.
Who are the top business jet brokers? I'm joking. I think you're just upset people.
Thank you. Thanks for not making me answer that question.
What other tips would you give to someone trying to build a team? Should they be doing what you're doing? Should they always be looking out for someone to, and you recommend taking from competitors?
No, not always. Sometimes, but sometimes it's hard. You take from a competitor, and just Gulfstream Bombardier swapped a couple people not too long ago. And, all of a sudden you've got the Bombardier person wearing a Gulfstream hat, going and visiting customers, and the customer's like, hey, wait a minute. You were telling me this airplane was, 2 weeks ago, you were telling me not to buy this airplane. Now you're telling me, hey, it's the best thing since sliced bread. So there's your struggles. I think the best thing to do is always figure out, what are you really looking for in the role? What do you need? The thing that scares me the most is when people are out there looking for salespeople and they say, we need a hitter. We want somebody who's going to change the business. And that scares me, because there's a what's the word I want to say? They want something, but they don't know what it is. And then I have to walk them back and no, you don't want a hitter. You want a process person. You want somebody who can identify what's the total available market in their territory. They can create a structure that's going to tell you how they're going to touch everybody in that market in their territory. And then you're going to show somebody, you want somebody who's going to show you the metrics behind touching all the people in the industry. And ultimately, if they're touching 100 people or 1,000 people, and they're going through the process, you're going to see remarkable results. And it's It's a sales process. It's not, we want to hit her. That's, I like the metrics driven approach. So it comes down to, I'm working with a company now and they're like, they want a total cultural change. And I'm like, what do you need from a cultural change? And we need somebody who really understands the numbers, somebody who really understands the processes, but can also is a motivational, can really come in and put the numbers and the processes into the team and show them what success looks like. I mean, that to me is there's a company that knows, kind of what the problem in the business is and what they're looking for down the road.
That's really interesting because I 100% see why a company's going to go, I want a rainmaker. The best way to get your team selling is to have someone out there selling, 10 times to show and lead. But that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And is it easy to find those people?
No. Well, the process people, yeah, because it's easier to find it's easier to find a process person because they can walk you through the process. Hey, here's they go to a board presentation or they give you, hey, look, this is, before you go into the interview, tell me what you're going to say. Tell me how you're going to show these people what they do. And they can walk you through exactly what their process looks like. Or if it's a CEO or if it's a CFO, or they walk them through the process. This is what your business is lacking. This is what we want it to look like. This is what you want it to look like. Here's what's missing in each of the chains. Here's how we fix it. And here's how we move forward. Versus a rainmaker comes in and says, I'm going to go, hey, hire me. I'm a great guy. I'm going to go make sales. I'm going to go fix operations. But they're long on the promises, but short on the how. And that to me is where a lot of disconnects are. And candidly, that's why I like operations people and finance people more as business leaders than salespeople.
Although ironically, I see you as more of a rainmaker.
I'm actually kind of process oriented, to be honest. But let me put it this way. I would be a brutal vice president of sales. If I was at one of these companies, I would be brutal because I would look at the territories and here would be my process. And it would be very simple. You're going to go into a territory and you're going to tell me what that total available market looks like. Or I'm going to have my market researchers say, business aviation, how many wealthy people are there in this demographic? And you can go by lists. And I'll use a story that goes back a couple of years. And I'm going to find out how many people can actually afford the product or will be an influencer to somebody who can afford the product. And then I'm going to talk to the salespeople and I'm going to say, okay, how many people did you touch? Show me. I want to see how many phone calls, how many emails, how many forms of communication how many times did you reach out to potential buyers on a routine basis? And I'm going to paint by the numbers. And, when you see people that say, I'm a relationship person, I really don't like making cold calls. Well, if you're in sales, I'm sorry, it's cold call business. It may not be a cold call business, but it's a warm call business. But this little guy is your friend. And that's how I would run that's how I would be a sales, that's how I would run a sales territory. And that's what, I'm very successful at what I do because I run my business that way. I used to keep a list every day, a log. How many phone calls did I make? How many emails did I send out? What was my personal production for the day? And I just don't. That's what scares me in business and in some of the businesses. I don't see that focus or that process.
That's amazing. I didn't know you. That's really interesting. Ironically, though, you're never going to be hired by a large organization, are you? You just couldn't do it.
Never say never, but it would take it would take a big budget. Let's put it that way for them to woo me over. Yeah, not that I'm money driven. I'm not. I look at life like this. If I do the things I need to do to be successful, everything else follows. I spend a lot of time with my wife. I have a great marriage. I spend a lot of time with my kids. Love it's family guy, and I've got a really tight family. And so I think about that's when you're doing the things you need to do to be successful, everything else follows. And that's kind of what, but it comes down to, as I told you, I tell the story, and I did a search a long time ago for a fractional aircraft operator, and they wanted to build a sales team. So they, I was interviewing people and I was like, all right, you say we hire you, how are you going to run your territory? And the easiest way for them to get bounced out of the process was, well, I expect them to give me leads. And I'm like, well, why don't you just go buy your own list of leads? Why don't you just go buy your own list? And they're like, well, would the company pay for that? And I'm like, $250 for a marketing list. You can go find, demographics of anybody you want. And, so ultimately that's, it was kind of like, hey, all right, you're not the right person because you're afraid to go pay $250 for a list to invest in your own success. So it comes down to executives. Good executives are always willing to invest in their own success. Conferences, coaches, podcasts, business books. If you're not willing to invest in yourself, why would anybody else invest in you?
World Aerospace Directory. That was like $600 when you bought it.
The what? The World Aviation Directory?
Yeah.
Oh my God!
Cheap,
yeah. No, it was expensive. It came like this. It's like this big, thick, 3-inch book. You're like, holy crap! We gotta get through this thing, but you do it. I mean, but that's it. But and I think that's where. But I think that's where, that's where, people get frustrated with the coach is going to come out of me now. People get frustrated with where they are. My company won't. I'm trapped in this cubicle. Well, you're really not. Comfort is an enemy to people. And, when you get stale, you get stagnant, you got to, you just change a little bit. And that's where I'm like, hey, I'll tell CEOs, do you ever email the CEO of 9 of your competitors or 9 of your suppliers? Or do you ever just say, let's go have coffee or get on an air, go buy a plane ticket and go meet a couple of them and talk about what they're doing, what's successful? And they're like, well, no. I'm like, well, why not? You've earned that right. And
which is one of the benefits when you get to a certain level is it probably makes sense to be on another board, isn't it?
It makes sense to be on another board, but for a junior executive, let's just say you're a junior executive and you're really, you're sort of feeling stuck. I can fly anywhere in the country for $500. I don't know. Yeah, look, it's not, it's not insignificant. $500 plus a hotel and a rental car, it's $1,000. But it's $1,000 to go learn something. I'll go back when I was living in Europe. I'm trying to think about what Craig -2 is going to look like after the Navy. I spent $800. I went to DC. I bought a suit. I was probably the most ridiculous person in the world. I was like 30 years old. I was the most ridiculous person in the world. I bought a suit and a briefcase. The briefcase was empty. And I went to this Aviation Week conference that was headlined by, it was like an investor conference. It was Aviation Week investor conference. It was the Ritz-Carlton in Washington, D.C. I crashed on my buddy's couch at the Pentagon. And I showed up and I'm looking around and everybody's looking at me like, who the hell are you and why are you here? And I shrugged my shoulders and I started talking to these guys. I'm like, yeah, I'm just getting out of the Navy. I'm over in Europe. I'm trying to figure out what -2 is. And they're like, hey, come on over and talk to us at cocktail hour. We want to talk to you. And that person who was saying, come on over and talk to us during cocktail hour just happened to be the CEO of Raytheon.
Wow.
I'm like, okay, I'll come talk to you. I don't know who you are, but I'll come talk to you. And then Ken Cressa, Northrop Grumman CEO, was there. He's like, yeah, come on over, have a cocktail with me. Now I was smart enough to drink club soda, but that's what happens when you start to invest in yourself. And that's where I really start to push these young kids and saying, hey, look, if you're not willing to invest in you, why should I, or why should your boss, or why should anybody else? It's on you. It's your career.
I think we had I can't remember the exact number. I think we had about 15 students at CJI Miami last year. And it's amazing on LinkedIn where you see them popping up going, I'm so excited to be starting here. I had so much fun on the JSSI internship program. It's just awesome watching it.
Yeah.
It's that similar. What advice would you give to someone? Well, you've given some, but to someone starting out in the industry is what? Show up.
Show up, be present. I'm going to use my son as an example, and you think you know your kids. And I really didn't. I do, but I don't. And I'll tell you why. My son went off to college. He went to Carolina, and he's a paramedic now. But he's real tight with my wife. They've got this unbelievable relationship. And I'm reading essays. He's applying to med school, and I'm reading essays that he's writing. And I'm listening to what he did in college. I'm like, did you really do all this? He's like, he went to school full time. He worked 30 hours in a lab a week. Wow. He volunteered 1,000 hours as a volunteer EMT for Orange County, North Carolina. And now he's a paramedic. And he did all this while going to college full time. Wow. And I'm like, you really did all this? He's like, yeah. And I'm like, holy. And he was talking to me. I'm like, all right, so when you're on the ambulance, what's your thought process? And he says, when I show up, there's a couple things that I want people to immediately know. It's never about me. It's always about you. I'm present. You are my only focus at the moment. And I'm listening to him talk, and I think about all the things he got involved in. But the one thing that really stood out was, I am present when I am here with you. And that's kind of my advice to executives, to CEOs, CFOs. It's never about me. It's my ego. It's always about my company, my investors, my employees. Sometimes you have to make hard decisions. But if you make if you're present and you're making the focused decisions, once again, everything else tends to work out pretty well. You'll run a good business.
Awesome. And what advice would you give to someone buying an aircraft?
Ooh, go find I would know more. I would no more buy an airplane without a really good broker behind me, a good acquisitions person. I would go find a really good acquisitions person, and I would have that person hold my hand every step of the way, especially as a first-time buyer. And then I would put a whole bunch of money in a pot and quit worrying about the individual line item costs, and just understand that at the end of the year, that pot of money is probably going to be empty, and you're going to be happy, and you're good.
And just think of the time you've saved.
Think of the time you saved. Yeah, look, it's great. Wall Street Journal. Did you see a Wall Street Journal article talking about the resurgence of business aviation, how more people are flying private, be it charter fraction.
Was that the Instagram one?
It was no. That one everybody's hoping goes away, I think. This one was like 2 days ago. I'll send it to you, but it was a great Wall Street Journal article, and it was talking about people now, they're successful people are saying, hey, look, the cost of a business jet trip or two is worth it. But candidly, look, if I'm a $10 million company, $20 million, $30 million, $40 million company, in the Midwest US, or, I want a King Air, or I want a Pilatus, or I want a light jet, because, the airlines aren't going to get any better. And I think that just having having that flexibility adds a tremendous amount to the business. I mean, I think that, business aviation is one of the most productive tools to industry in the world.
So normally I could say, if you want to find out more, go to Craig's website. But you also, since 2018, have been doing a fantastic aerospace executive podcast. How many have you done now?
Almost 300.
That's an amazing number. Are there any that stand out?
I just interviewed the CEO of United Launch Alliance, Tori Bruno. I do a lot with a guy named Bill Alderman, who's an investment banker. I've had some. There's a fella. His company's called EMO. Brian Olson is his name. EMO Advisors. That one's about ready to come out. He was on the search committee for Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft. He was part of that search committee to replace Steve Ballmer. And I'm listening to him, and he's an executive coach, and he helps build organizations or helps organizations. I learn, the things I learn on these podcasts are just absolutely amazing. I mean, I'm like, wow, you're kidding me. So I love doing these things, because what I learn is amazing.
Has it brought in any business for you?
I don't really use it. I don't really use it to bring in business. It's like everything, the more present you are in the market, the more people recognize your name. I started it out because candidly, I was trying to figure out something to energize me. And I met this guy, Matt Johnson, who's out of San Diego. He's got this company called Pursuing Results, and he became my producer, and he helps me with it. And I just started out as something fun. And like Bob Sullivan with FlexJet has been on a couple of times. Bob's awesome. Talks to me about what, why their pilots decertified the union. I thought it was great. I've had the guys from Clay Lacey on talk about how they're building cultures. And they've grown a great business over the last couple of years. Alan McReynolds with Westar Aviation was on with Stephen Maiden. And those guys talk about what they're building, and it's fun to watch. So I just really did it to kind of do something different, be out there, be present. So I never asked for any, like people keep telling me, you're going to go for sponsors? No, not a sponsorship thing.
I'm trying to think, who would you take? Would you take sponsorship for? Would you have a list of companies you wouldn't take it from?
I don't even know. I think that just opens up, like, it just creates problems. That just create. I'm a simple guy. I don't like problems. That just opens up problems.
But if someone wants to give you a Range Rover or a couple of boxes of top Scotch whiskey, you'd take that.
Yeah, I don't know. No, I wouldn't. Let's just be friends. Come on, do a podcast with me. Let's be friends. And tell me what, the one thing I don't like to do, I get a lot of people calling me up, and they want me to be basically, kind of an advertisement for their business. And I'm like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to talk about your business. I want to talk about what's happening in your business that people would really, have an interest in. How are you looking at the industry differently? How are you growing engineers? Why are your pilots decertifying the union? Why, what's the next challenge in outer space? And those are kind of the things that people really gravitate to versus, I don't want to be some infomercial.
Great. Thank you so much. That was awesome. Really appreciate it.
Al, you're like my favorite guy in the industry. And I love reading your stuff. I love coming on your webinars. The conferences are great. Thanks for having me on. I love this.
Thanks, Kevin.